It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for the evening. For 35 years, photographer James Balog has broken new conceptual and artistic ground on one of the most important issues of our era, human modification of our planet. An avid mountaineer with a graduate degree in geography and geomorphology, Mr. Balog has become a global spokesperson on the subject of climate change and human impact on the environment. He founded the Extreme Ice Survey, the most wide-ranging, ground-based photographic study of glaciers ever conducted. As a consequence of his historic work, in 2009, he served as a U.S. NASA representative at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, COP15, in Copenhagen. Additionally, in 2015, at COP21 in Paris, he made numerous presentations on behalf of the Natural Resources Defense Council, the United Nations Foundation, and Solutions COP21. Mr. Balog and the Extreme Ice Survey team were featured in the 2012 internationally acclaimed award-winning documentary Chasing Ice, which won an Emmy and was shortlisted for an Oscar. And in fact, it's available on Netflix right now, so I would encourage you to watch it if you haven't. Mr. Balog has given multimedia presentations about his project at dozens of major public institutions, including the White House, the US Congress, NASA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Apple, and more. Mr. Balog has been honored with numerous awards for his work, which is featured in public and private art collections across the country. Additionally, on March 23rd, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago will open Extreme Ice, an exhibit that will feature Mr. Balog's photography and videography to tell the story of melting glaciers. And now we have a really special treat. For the first time, we will get to see a sneak peek of James's new documentary. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome and joining me, James Balog.
Well, thank you, Keith, and thanks to everyone here. It's been a wonderful evening already, and I just barely got started, so thank you for having me here. Donna, Keith, the entire Economic Club organization. Boy, this has been a really smooth day. You guys know how to put on a good show, so thanks for that. Here we go. You know, we live in curious times, and one of the curiosities of our time is that language and semantics are under attack. And another curious thing is that the very notion of science is under attack, that there's an objective reality that people have understood and analyzed and measured for a long time, and that somehow that might not be real. So I've inserted a little something into this show that I hope will address some of those points. Let's start with this little curious point. See if we can agree on semantics, okay? So here we go. So on the left, this globular cluster stops. What is that called? Shout it out. Let me hear it. Grapes. Okay, we can all agree on grapes. What's in the middle? It might be an orange. Some people say it's an orange. But in any case, it's a yellow or an orange object. That's a fruit. On the right, we have a strawberry. Okay, so I'm trying to point out that there is a common thing called English language, and the words mean something, and they're not to be bent around. There is something that's concrete about the way we describe the world. Another example. Some of you have seen me walking around today with this funny little volleyball. Now, if I throw that up in the air, that audio sounds a little hot, guys. If I throw this up in the air, what happens? It comes back down, right? Because of a force called gravity, right. We can all agree on that. That's been understood and analyzed since the 1600s. It's been understood since before that by human observation. What would happen if you put your hands in those glasses full of ice and you held the ice in your hands? What would happen to it? It would melt, right. These are observed points of reality, and science exists not to make computer models, not to make fancy equations, but simply to understand objective reality. Science is objective reality, reasonably observed, reasonably understood by reasonable people. And it's vital that we continue to understand that and protect that amazing edifice of science that's grown up over the centuries and is so much a part of our lives. That light is on right now because of science. We got here on wheeled transport because of science. We fly through the air because of science. We survive because of something called medical science. It's integral to our lives. And these attempts on the part of various forces in our society to discredit science because it happens to get in the way of some political and economic agendas is frankly flat out wrong. So what I'd like to talk about, thank you. Thank you. With that, I'll throw the ball out there, okay. So what's important to focus on here is this. There's a difference between evidence and belief. You know, I often have people say to me, do you believe in climate change? And my answer is always no. I don't believe in climate change. I think climate change is real based on the evidence that so many thousands of women and men have observed in science and that I've observed in my own reality as a photographer with my work based on science. I don't believe in climate change. Belief is an important thing to the human race. Particularly, it helps us understand the great existential and metaphysical problems. We don't know where we came from. We don't know why we're living on this stone swirling around in this galaxy. We don't know where we're going after we die. Belief is really good for giving us an anchor to sort out those great mysteries. But we don't need belief when it comes to climate change. The climate change story is based on evidence by rational people, reasonably observed, well understood. And I can't emphasize that enough. So, for the purposes of this narrative tonight, we're going to go down two different tracks of evidence that reveal the climate story. So, for about 200 years, scientists have understood, that if you alter the makeup of the air that's around us, it changes the way heat is retained in that air. This isn't something that was made up by a bunch of hippie scientists in Berkeley and Boulder. I can say that because I live in Boulder, Colorado. This wasn't made up in the past 25 years just because they were trying to get research grants. This has been understood since way back in the 19th century. The basic physics and chemistry of air are immutable. And essentially what happens is if you change the carbon dioxide, the methane, and the nitrous oxide concentrations in the air essentially gets, it doesn't exactly get thicker, but it acts as a blanket. It holds the heat into the surface of the Earth. And it's because of that action of changing the chemistry that the air is warming right now. And again, for the purposes of this narrative, we're going to go down two tracks here. One is the burning forest track. You've already seen some of that. And the other one is the melting ice track. And this is especially an issue in the western U.S. from basically Denver all the way to California, from northern Canada all the way to Arizona. But in our current time, because the air is heating up, it's drying out, and everybody can intuitively understand that when you dry out vegetation and you have hotter air temperatures, it makes the forests more prone to fires. And that's exactly what's happening. We have more fires, they're bigger fires, and the fire season lasts longer. My friends Bob and Gail Loveman, who are part of the Economic Club, but also live right near me in the foothills of the Rockies, are on the fire department out there. And they spend much of their time now fighting fires in the middle of the winter because it gets so dry and it can get so warm. In January, we have fires. We just had a cycle of fires a week or two ago. So this is happening. This is active. And a recent very distinguished science paper came up with the calculation last year that almost 10.5 million acres of additional land has been burned in the past 30 years because of human-caused climate change. So this is real and immediate. This is what it looks like. It may be a little hard for some of you in the back to see this, but There is a sort of a mid-sized tower of flame with some little firefighters there on the right going up this fire line. This was on the big Sobranis fire last summer near Carmel, California. We've been filming wildfires the past 3 summers. As part of this new film, I think the wildfire work is done, although I have to admit, as a photographer, nothing is ever done, nothing is ever finished. You can always think of another shot, and that's why a photographer will always say, hey, stop, one more, just look at me, that little different way, one more. But for now, it's done, and it's brutal, hard work. Many people think that me running around on the Greenland ice sheet and rappelling down into crevasses is scary and dangerous. It's nothing compared to what these fires are like. It's hot, it's miserable, the fires move fast, they're scary as can be. And there are rules that help you work around them and predict what they're going to do, but you never really know. These people do incredibly heroic work. It's tough on the lungs, it's tough on the backs and the bodies and the knees, and they don't last long out on the fire lines. Terrible for their condition of their lungs, the particulates that get jammed up in their chests. It's a 19-year-old young woman from Modesto, California, whose favorite sport is lifting weights so that she can keep up with the guys on the fire crew. And this was a fire that almost took out my own house 6 years ago. And this was what was left of one of my neighbor's houses and his Jeep. The global temperatures are rising. There is no doubt about this. This is measured. This is very, very well understood. Not a computer model. These are thermometers, a standardized thermometer system that's all around the world. This is the evidence that we've seen over the past 16 years. The hottest temperature ever recorded in Antarctica was recorded this week. News just came out yesterday. And this is supposed to be sort of the equivalent of September in Antarctica. It's supposed to be cooling off right now, and yet it's warm. And this is also difficult to see, especially in the back, so I'm not going to linger long on here, but we have a profound understanding of the temperature record of what the Earth has been doing for nearly the past 1 million years. And it comes from analysis of the layers of air bubbles that are in the ice cores that we can bring up from Antarctica and Greenland. You can drill holes down through the ice sheets, pull up these cores of ice, analyze the air chemistry, and you can tell what the temperature of the air was during those storms 100,000, 200,000, 400,000 years ago. And there's a basic pattern that's been very, very well understood for a long time. And essentially, it's that the Earth, if left to its own devices, has a carbon dioxide oscillation in the air that ranges between 180 parts per million and 280 parts per million. And it's been doing that for as far back as we have a record. Right now, we've broken out of that in the course of the past 100 years because of burning fossil fuels and dumping the waste products in the atmosphere. So we're no longer peaking out at 280. In fact, Earth should be going towards a cooler cycle right now. If you look at the detailed record of what's been going on, it should be cooling off and we should be sliding into another ice age. But we're not, because the CO2 is at 406 as of the past couple of days, and it's continuing to climb as we continue to alter the chemistry of the air. So there is no explanation for this breaking out of natural variation except for what we're doing with fossil fuels. One final point. Where does the oscillation come from? Where do these peaks and valleys come from? Many of you are in business. You're accustomed to looking at graphs. You can see patterns. You can see shapes in these curves. It comes from something called the Milankovitch Cycles. The Earth doesn't go around the sun in a perfectly predictable way. It's predictable, but it's not unchanging. And as the shape of that orbit changes over the eons, you get more or less warming of the Earth, and that creates hotter and cooler periods, and that's what triggers the ice ages. There's also some wobble in the axis of the Earth that's also part of the system. But as I say, according to the Milankovitch cycles, should be cooling off right now, and it's not. So what we have is a gigantic casino. That's also why I use that slot machine analogy in the beginning. We have 97% of the scientists who know this field think that we have human-caused climate change. We have 3% who think we maybe need some more research, and a few who are paid propagandists who are trying to discredit this information. But I think that very, very few people, if faced with, say, a lung cancer or a cardiac problem, would be willing to go around to 97 doctors who said they had a problem and they needed action on it and keep looking for the 3 doctors out of 100 who would say, oh, don't worry about that tumor in your lungs, just keep it there, it's fine, chew some gum or something and it'll go away. No, you wouldn't do that. 97% is as good a plurality of the human condition, the human opinion, human race as we get. And we have to act on this. Not to act on it is foolish. So back to the narrative. Now we're going down the melting ice track. A lot of this work I've done comes from this National Geographic story I photographed in 2006. I have been an alpinist, a very avid one, since I was in my late teens. I've traveled the world climbing mountains. I've had a lot of assignments that took me to big mountain ranges, but it was this story that triggered this notion that glaciers are alive. They don't have blood, they don't have hearts, but they're these dynamic organisms that react to the touch of the air and the water around them. And they're responding, they're representative of the regional climate. And what I realized is that so many of these glaciers were retreating and that they were the canary in the global coal mine. It was the place where you can see and touch and hear and feel climate change in action. So instead of going back all the time, I mean every couple of months to photograph the changes, I decided I would build this camera system of time-lapse cameras and leave the cameras behind and let them do the observation for me. So they're Nikon cameras in these little Pelican housings that are modified. It's a plastic box modified with a glass window, solar energy collected, run through a battery, and then there's a custom-made computer timer that tells the camera when to fire. And these things are bolted to bedrock in various places all around the world. As we sit here tonight, I've got 36 cameras out, ranging from Greenland to Antarctica. We've had as many as 43. We had some at Mount Everest, but there was a political shift there and we lost our permit. So those cameras are down for the moment. But we've been out in the field for 10 years already. When I started this project, I thought it would be a 3 to 5 year exercise. Now we're at 10, and we hope to go on for another 10 years, funding permitting. That's a big question mark right now. But we're hoping to actually put cameras all the way down through the Andes because South America is a big story. Here's one of the cameras. That's a little mountain up there in the top left called Mount Everest. And the camera is bolted to bedrock at 19,500 feet, looking down on that great river of ice, the Khumbu Glacier, as it changes. Keith mentioned this film, Chasing Ice, so I'd like to show you the trailer from Chasing Ice so you can get a taste of what goes on in the field and be inspired to go home and watch Netflix. Here goes. And without the story that the camera records for us, we'd have no memory of this. They're really magical devices for preserving an image that would otherwise be gone. So there's where the glacier was. We turned time backwards. That's what was. That's what it became. And I expect that this summer that ice will almost certainly disappear around the corner. We have to actually move these cameras up the valley to keep up with this retreat. Here's another site, one of our glaciers in Iceland, the Solomajökull. This was 2007. Everything I have, there's time lapse, but to save time, I'm just going to show you a few repeat pairs. This is 2007. That's 2016. That's over a mile of a retreat. And honest to God, I studied what's called geomorphology in graduate school, the study of how the Earth surface is formed and shaped, and I never imagined I'd be watching rivers and lakes forming in the course of this project. Here's a glacier in Switzerland, the Trift. 9 years apart. I have to go back and repeat this pair this summer. Now, Greenland is an amazing place. It's nearly a continent-sized island. The thing is covered with ice, and everything you see there in the bright colors is ice. And this is a NASA animation of how it flows out from the center of Greenland and pours into the ocean. This contributes more to, this contributes about half of sea level rise ongoing in the world today. And the The area has warmed up tremendously. The ice loss has accelerated, and I'm going to take you down there on the bottom center of Greenland. In this picture is a glacier called the Elusive Glacier. And we put out, we had a crew watch, waiting for a huge break-off event of ice, and we caught the biggest, what's called a calving event that's ever been put on film. And it's a huge place, and it's really hard to get a sense of really what's going on. I've camped out here a lot, and I've hiked around here, but even so, I don't quite get it. So I have to resort to some cheesy illustrations. No self-respecting photographer would do this, but how big is the glacier? And that block of ice that broke off was about 3 miles in one direction by a mile in another direction, and it's about equivalent north to south to 2 Golden Gate bridges, if you've ever driven across those bridges in San Francisco Bay. But the analogy they really love in Washington, D.C. is how many U.S. Capitol buildings would it take to fill up that block? And the answer is 3,000. We know from watching TV and from being on the Washington Mall, that's a good-sized building. So 3,000 buildings would have fit in that block. This is not an abstraction. Sea level is rising at the rate, on average, around the world of about 1/8 of an inch per year. That rate is accelerating as a consequence of this accelerating ice loss. Some coastlines get more than that because of the way wind, weather, and gravitational movements work. The East Coast, central East Coast of the U.S. is getting a good bit more than 1/8 of an inch per year. So those huge bergs that break off turn into smaller ones yet that are small enough for my daughter, Emily, when she was 10 years old and was with me in Iceland, for her to hold. But piece by piece by piece, this is the immediacy and reality of climate change and sea level rise in action. And the children of today are going to have to deal with the consequences of our actions tomorrow. This is not an abstraction. Their coastlines will be submerged. They will not be living in the same places, in the same conditions that we experience on the coastlines today. And as it happens, people in the developing world will be taking an unnaturally large brunt of this situation. So I'd like to, I know this has been a lot of science and policy and so forth, but I'd like to break away and for a minute look at the beauty and the character of ice through this piece that's a combination of my photos, a melody written by the great cinematic composer Ennio Morricone, and sung and lyrics by Sarah Brightman. And then I'll come back to share a few final thoughts with you. Here goes. Thank you. Thank you. In case it wasn't obvious, that was kind of a love letter to the ice, It's a crazy thing to fall in love with, but when you spend a lot of time out there, it's just insanely beautiful. That's why we have the show at MSI coming up, and that's why I've spent 10 years looking at this stuff. Every time I go out, I think, oh man, I've shot everything there is to photograph, and man, I'm done with it. I should leave my cameras at home, and every single time there's something new. And by the way, speaking of history and old affections, I want to shout out a couple of people who are very near and dear to me. My old college roommate, Peter Gore, is here from the Sierra Club. Dr. Janice Mendelson, who was my shipmate in Antarctica, is here. And my comrade in art, Jeannie Gang, is here. So thanks to all of you guys. I don't believe in just doing science for science's sake. I don't believe in doing art for art's sake. I believe in combining the two, and I believe in using them to shape public opinion. And I'm really happy to say that at a lot of different levels, whether it's corporate or NGOs or public engagements like this, university engagements, or major international policy leaders, we have been really successful in putting this visual evidence out into the world and shaping the way people are thinking about the world around them. Made a major presentation at the White House at one point, several presentations to the Congress, the UN meetings that you heard about, the UK House of Commons. It's been amazing, the power of this combined evidence of art and science. Which leads me to a key point. Lots of people say to me, what can I do about this? And we'll talk about this a little bit in the Q&A. What can I do about climate change? And the truth of the matter is, I don't really know what any one of you can do. I don't know the details of your lives, except to say in a general metaphoric sense, use your voice. And that's your voice in terms of politics. That's your voice in terms not just of national politics, but city and state politics, where you can make changes in what's happening. Well, again, we'll talk more about that. But it's also your voice in terms of how you think about the world, how you shape your family life, how you shape your business life, what your business does. That's your voice. I happen to have a voice as a speaker and as a photographer and a communicator. My filmmaking team does too. But we each have voices in different ways. It's important to remember and recognize that. Because the fact of the matter is, we all have choices. We have choices to be pessimistic or optimistic. We have choices to think short-term or long-term. Most importantly, I think that we have a choice to decide whether or not we're going to deal with this issue. It's really easy to kind of back off and be cynical and say, you can't do anything about it. It's too big, it's too hard, it's too tiring, it's too whatever. And believe me, at 3 o'clock in the morning on my sleepless nights, I sometimes feel like that too. But I've made a choice to say, I'm going to get up in the morning and I'm going to do my part to move the needle forward, 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 forward. But at an even deeper level, I think our society has a profound moral and ethical choice. And the moral and ethical choice is to say, who are we? Are we generous? Do we have an altruistic streak left in us? Or are we so debased and corrupted by consumer materialism that we just say, we don't care what happens to the future. We're going to take everything for ourselves, and damn the torpedoes. The kids can deal with it, the grandkids can deal with it, people we don't know can deal with climate change. We don't really care. I don't think we are that. I think we are better than that. I think we're way, way better than that. But we happen to live in a system that's been making it somewhat difficult for us to express those better angels of our nature, as Lincoln put it. I think we have a lot of respect for ourselves. I think we have a lot of respect for our families. We have respect for our friends. We have respect for this beautiful blue planet that we're happy to inhabit. I mean, it's incredible to me that today when I was walking along the lake, I thought, you guys are so lucky to live by this big inland ocean. This is a fantastic place. That's part of the planet. That's not an abstraction. That's not something far, far away. That's here. And you have a love and affection for that. So that respect translates into what is the ultimate issue that surrounds climate change, and that is, how much do we love? How much do we love ourselves? How much do we love this place? How much do we love our communities, our families, our people? And are we willing to act on that and do the best we can? Thank you.
So let me start off with a couple of questions before we open it up to our audience, and please start thinking about your questions. So James, photographer, scientist, adventurer. I know you love being an adventurer. And seeing those film clips up there, you're putting yourself in danger. You want to talk about a near-death experience?
Oh boy, well, if you watch Chasing Ice, there's a scene that actually, there's two scenes in there that terrify me when I look at them. My mother won't even look at one of those scenes. There's a moment when I had been chasing for about 5 years. I was trying to look at a waterfall going down into the Greenland ice sheet and disappearing down in this crevasse. And we finally found the right situation in this canyon. And in a moment of obstreperous optimism, I rappelled down into this huge meltwater channel, and I laid down on the floor of the channel and leaned out over this broken balcony of ice that was about to collapse, because I had to get my camera over the edge and look down to this waterfall that was dropping 3,000 feet down through the ice sheet. And I remember thinking at the time that I had a plan if that balcony collapsed. And I had my ice hammers in my waist, and I had my crampons on my feet, and I always figured, well, okay, there's 2 ropes tying me up to the surface. Balcony collapses, I'll go in head first, and I'll just climb back out. But I look at that now, and I think an awful lot of things could have gone wrong. And not the least of which was that I probably would have swung into that gushing waterfall of 33-degree water, and I would have been hypothermia in about 2 seconds and not been able to move. Another scene in the film was when a helicopter engine started to fail, and we were running a very serious risk of having to ditch in the ocean. And that is a really, really ugly prospect in Greenland. So that's in the film, but there's probably 15 more stories I could tell about volcanoes and avalanches and all sorts of wretched things, but I won't.
Thank you. Getting to climate change, how did the issue of climate change become so politicized? And is that a United States phenomenon, or is that global?
Yeah, you know, I don't live in Europe, so it's a little hard for me to comment with full accuracy, but I've been over there quite a bit and have a lot of friends there and have been involved with these issues with Europeans. And I don't have the impression that it is as politicized in Europe. This, unfortunately, has become a political football here. And I think that's really wrong. And I think it's profoundly, deeply unfortunate. Climate change is a universal issue. It doesn't matter if you're left-wing or right-wing, Republican or Democrat. We all breathe the same air. We're all dependent on the same stuff. And it's in our survival interest to breathe good air, just as it's in our survival interest to eat good food and drink good water. And so I think it's, at best it's sad, and it might be criminal, that climate change has been turned into a political football and turned into something that we just argue back and forth, and at least at the national level have been not making enough strides on. At the state and local level, lots and lots and lots of jurisdictions are making great progress. A lot of entrepreneurs are making amazing progress on new technologies and new opportunities as a consequence of this. But this paralysis at the national level is really sad, if not criminal, and I fear that our children, by the time they're our ages, will be looking back at this era and shaking their heads and just being baffled at how in God's name we could have been so slow to react to the clear and present information and danger that's all around us. Thank you.
Okay, so let's open it up to the audience. If you have a question, stand, look for a staff member with a green paddle, and they'll run you over a microphone.
Do they hit people with the paddles? Oh, no, it's okay.
Well, why don't we start with Catherine Gale.
Thank you. James, this has been fabulous. Back in 2014, the Pentagon labeled climate change as a threat multiplier. Can you talk about that, meaning it's not just that it's going to inundate our shorelines, but what it does to our national security, and also whether you think that that assessment has a chance to continue to be considered in the current administration?
Oh, boy.
Sorry.
The first one I can answer. The second one, I don't know. But the threat multiplier issue is this. The Pentagon every 4 years comes out with a quadrennial defense report, it's called. And in it, they assess where the hazards are going forward in the geopolitical future. And for quite some time now, they've been identifying climate change as being what's called a threat multiplier. Namely, that it takes instabilities in populations, in local political situations, in resource competition, and climate change layered on top of that multiplies those problems, compounds them, makes them more difficult. And in these quadrennial defense reports, they're always saying that it is going to create an obligation for the American military to respond. Because like it or not, we're the world's policemen. And so we pay in our taxes for those military interventions if they become necessary. Perfect example. Apparently, the Syrian Civil War, as catastrophic and tragic as that has been catalyzed, not necessarily caused, but catalyzed by climate change in the Middle East. There was a serious drought there 6, 7, 8 years ago, and a lot of young men who had been out on the farms in Syria were driven off the farms and wound up in the cities, and they became a destabilizing, very unhappy revolutionary force. And that's where a lot of the Syrian Civil War came from. There were other issues, there were all the sectarian issues, all the tragic things we know about, but the climate change multiplied the intensity of what was already embedded in the Syrian system, and look what's happened. And Syria continues to be a catastrophe that we haven't seen the end of yet. We don't know where it's going, and we don't know what it leads to. What the current administration will do in reaction to all of this, I can't even begin to guess. I've talked several times to people who are quite senior in the American government, and they all say that the fact that we don't really know what the true policies of the administration are is inherently at least unsettling. That's the kindest word, the mildest word I can put on it. And uncertainty is not what you want in international diplomacy. You want a steady hand, you want predictable understanding among nations, more or less. Of course, nations are always going to pull surprises, but we live in a period of exceptional uncertainty and unknowability right now.
Why don't we go to Michael Kraus? And we only have about another 12 minutes for questions, so to keep this going, we have 2 microphones going, so please stand up. And so let's start with Michael, and then we'll go to the next one.
So I'll be quick. Assuming we could get alignment in government, what kinds of political and policy actions would you call for, and do you want?
Did anybody see the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago? There was an op-ed piece written, the lead authors were Jim Baker, the former Secretary of State and Defense Secretary, and Hank Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, also signed by George Shultz, former Defense Secretary, and a number of corporate heads. And this article got a lot of play in the secondary reviews of it. And in it, they said, as conservatives, we think that we need to tax carbon coming out into our world. We need to stop burying it in the defense budget. We need to stop burying it in environmental protection budgets. We need to stop burying it in the medical budgets. We know that people are having respiratory problems because of pollution in the atmosphere. Let's internalize those costs and stop externalizing it. And we think the best way to do this is to make a level playing field and tax the cost of carbon coming into our socio-cultural environment. And that's amazing because the left wing has been arguing for the same thing for a long time too. So now, all of a sudden, we have both the left and the right saying, let's put a price on carbon. And this actually is an idea that's been around for well over 10 years. I can think of several different times that I've been aware of when various corporate groups have gotten together and gone to the president, whether it was George Bush, or it was Barack Obama, or it's Donald Trump. And they've said, let's straighten this out. We know we have to deal with climate change. Let's level the playing field. Let's have consistent policy across the nation and tax it at the federal level. Who knows where this will where this idea will take us? But that's I think one of the best things we can hope for right now. That would be a massive change, massive change.
I think we have a question over there, and then for the next one, feel free to stand up, and they'll run you over a microphone. So right there.
Yes, hi. My name is Anna, and I represent One Earth Film Festival. We're going into our 6th year starting tomorrow for 10 days. And I wanted to let you know that when we showed your film, Chasing Ice, we had our first 2 sellouts, complete total sellouts for just totally booked audiences. So I want to thank you for the message that you share in that film. I also wanted to ask you, so we're going to show The Age of Consequences, which is for the first time in 6 years, the first time we've ever seen the link, as you said earlier, about the refugee crisis, national security, and climate change. So we're going to be showing that twice this year. We think it's an important story. My question for you is when you sort of turned from photographer and observer to advocate, because I think that has real implications for us as citizens for when we turn from observers and bystanders to real advocates who want to see and participate in change.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I frankly avoided for much of my career being an advocate or an activist. I was wanting to function as an observer and an interpreter, and I wanted to find innovative ways to look at subjects like endangered species or deforestation or the intersection of people and technology, for better or for worse. And early in this ICE project, I was uncomfortable with getting out in front of audiences and speaking about it with the degree of intensity and passion that I've brought here this evening. And that's because I have often found a lot of activist positions to be exaggerated and hyperbolized, whatever the right adjective is. And I recognize that there's a lot of nuances in a lot of these situations. And for that matter, scientists themselves for many years were really reluctant to get out and really beat the table over these things because they're not accustomed to doing that either. Science is inherently conservative and cautious. Those guys like to measure things and just keep measuring and measuring and measuring and slicing and dicing forever and not reaching conclusions and saying, my God, you've got to deal with this. That's not what they do. And so I was cautious, but the more I saw what was going on around me, the more I realized, Jim, it's your moral obligation. It's my moral obligation to my kids to say something about this. I want to be able to tell them when I'm an old guy sitting in a rocking chair and I can't rappel into a crevasse anymore, that I did the best I could with the knowledge and experience and the observational tools I had. I was awake, I was paying attention.
So let's go to Ted Dysett first, and then the gentleman to my left. Ted?
Thank you for being with us today. Just a quick two-part question. Obviously, fossil fuels play an incredible part of where we're going. With economies like China and Africa coming online, what do you see as the role of nuclear in bridging the gap between where we are today and where we're going in terms of renewables? And second, while individuals can only have a small impact, we can have an impact. What do you think we can do individually in our day-to-day lives here in Chicago, in our own homes, to help the impact?
I did not pay him to ask that question. But the Chinese recognize that they've got a gigantic problem. They're losing 1 million plus people a year to respiratory distress and infections from the horrible pollution they have. They've become the international leaders in the manufacture of solar panels, wind turbines, and high mileage cars. They're quite serious about this. I have gotten to be friends over the past half dozen years with President Obama's science, technology, and primary energy advisor, Dr. John Holdren. And I was with him at a banquet at the American Embassy in Paris during the COP21, the Paris Accord meeting. And the Chinese position on this and the fact that we were working with them in tandem to move forward on climate change was a big, big topic. And the basic question, which I asked John, was, are the Chinese playing us? Do they really mean to do something about climate change? And he said, I've been sitting elbow to elbow with these guys for 3 years negotiating this strategy, and I can tell you they are absolutely bound and determined to deal with this, way more than our Congress is. And they're quite serious about moving the needle on this, and also because they recognize that they've got a fantastic market opportunity in altering the way energy is being generated and to some degree distributed around the world. And that brings us to a really important point. There are business opportunities here, and people are seizing them, and people in the United States are seizing them, and Europe are seizing them. Big companies, GE, Siemens, and it's real. I was just right now, ongoing still, is a conference over in the Marriott called the Climate Leadership Conference or Council or something. I gave the lunchtime speech over there yesterday. And in the afternoon, I listened to representatives from the University of California, Caesar's Palace, their entire national empire, and Amazon talk about how they're saving money and how happy they are to be saving gobs of money by changing their energy use. And the Caesar's Palace guy actually said, if Caesar's Palace can go green and save energy. Anybody can do it. And one other point I would make is we're never going to be off fossil fuels. There's been a lot of BS rhetoric about that, but it's not real. It's too central to our lives. And I have friends in the environmental community who would take issue with that. But I think given the chemicals that come out of natural gas and oil and the availability and portability of the fuels, we're going to be in that for a long time. It's just that we have to alter the balance of what we do, and we have to figure out a way to sequester the carbon. What can I do is kind of the essential answer that each one of us ask ourselves. So, number one point is we have to stay optimistic, as I already said. We have to use our voices, like I already said. The thing that so many of us want is we want a silver bullet. We just want to do one thing and say, oh, oof, it's going to be better. There is no one action. There's no one solution. No president of the United States could ever have it. No president of the Soviet Union or China or anywhere else could ever have it. We got into this pickle one tailpipe at a time, one smokestack at a time, and it's going to take a lot of incremental solutions to fix this. But we don't fundamentally have a problem with technology, economics, and policy. There are roadmaps for how to deal at all of those levels with this issue. And what we have is this problem of will. And in varying times, in varying places, different countries, different communities have different degrees of willpower to bring to this issue. If we were to take this as seriously as we did combat in World War II, or as we did going to the moon in the 1960s, we'd have this thing licked in 10 years. We would have major, major turnarounds in what we're doing and moving in the right direction. And again, things are happening. It's just a little harder to see it because of the way the noise cloud comes out of Washington. You can't see all the good things that are happening at the grassroots. And I would point out that the laws from the 70s about clean air, clean water, and endangered wildlife protection, and in general environmental protection, didn't come about because the feds decided that they had to do something. It came about because a lot of state and local jurisdictions legislated solutions to the pollution that they had all around them. The air was much worse in this country in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s than it is now. But that great left-wing radical, Richard Nixon, was listening to all the business leaders and political leaders coming to Washington going, Mr. President, we have a problem. We've got all these different laws all around the country, all these different regulations. We need to standardize this. Let's decide who we are. That's the same thing Hank Paulson and Jim Baker just said in the Wall Street Journal. So back in the day, we made great progress that needs to be maintained, by the way, and not taken apart by the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency. We made great progress. And we need to build on that because we all benefit from that. We breathe cleaner air and we have less asthma and we have less respiratory illness and COPD than we otherwise would because of those laws that were enacted in the early 70s. Now, since it doesn't look like we have slides to work with, I'm going to throw a couple personal points out. Again, use your voice, use your voice, use your voice. Secondly, I wager that every single person in this room has the financial wherewithal that the next time you need to buy a car, you can buy a hybrid. If you want a luxury hybrid, buy a Lexus. If you want an all-wheel drive, you can buy a Lexus. Look on a website called driveclean.ca.gov for a ranking of the pollution cleanliness of cars. And it's a modest premium to the cost, compared to the cost of a gas-burning car. But it's a minor, minor increment at the level of income and spending that I think everybody in this room enjoys. And it's your contribution. In the absence of a federal carbon tax, it's your own private tax, and you can wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, say to yourself, say to your kids, I did what I could on that front. So do that. Take one step and do that. Another thing you can do is, there's about 25 other things. It's all online. The clock has run out. It's telling me red, 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 we have to stop. So I'll let it go at that. But you've been a great audience. Thanks for
James,
listening.
thank you.